to discuss the housing assessment update. So, Mr. Isham, that's right. I know I was pronouncing it incorrectly.
I accept all pronunciations of my last name.
I think I said them all, so.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Recently on August 22nd, staff brought our fourth quarterly update related to the Code Next project. Tonight we begin our discussion on the second component of that project, which is the city's housing needs assessment. Here with us from Root Policy Research again are Mollie, Fitzpatrick, and Frankie Lewingt. They will present their analysis of the data that they've collected regarding housing affordability and availability within the city and our existing conditions, open up some discussions surrounding household groups that are not currently having their housing needs met within our city, inform council of a recent engagement and listening session held with members of our local development community, and discuss potential housing strategies and toolkits. And with that, we'll let Mollie and Frankie take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Bryan. Good evening, Mayor and council members. We are really delighted to be with you tonight, so thank you for carving out some time in your work session to focus on housing a little bit. I will, I think, hopefully kickstart. I'm just going to point this thing till it works. Okay, perfect. So obviously, we're with Root Policy Research, as Bryan mentioned. We are a local or Denver-based economic and policy firm. We do a lot of housing work all over the country, but particularly here in Colorado, and we've been doing a ton of work with local communities, just like yourselves, that are kind of walking through a lot of these planning grant processes from state funding, and we do a lot of this in conjunction with planning and zoning, and so we're working really closely with the Code Next team as well. So we personally love it when those are kind of paired up so that we can talk both about zoning, but start to implement some of those changes in particular, or kind of in the immediate sense. Bryan did a great job kind of running through our agenda tonight. So I'm going to do just kind of a quick introduction, and then Frankie is going to walk us through the existing conditions, so a lot of the data analysis. But we'll do that pretty briefly, because really what we want to do is start to test out your thoughts and hear your kind of discussion and points on a variety of housing toolkit ideas. So kind of some things you can do to help address needs. We're not at the point yet where we're presenting recommendations or have those tailored. We really just kind of want to talk through in general, what does housing strategy, what does housing policy look like, and just get some of your just initial kind of gut reactions to some of those, so that we have a better sense from you what types of strategies you would like us to explore in more depth, what things you want us to look at, or if there are other things that you've heard about in communities that maybe aren't on our list right now that you want to make sure are on our list for consideration. So tonight is not necessarily a, this is what we think you should do. It's a lot more of, hey, here's some ideas. What do you all think? What are you hoping for your community? And what do you hope to get out of this housing needs assessment and strategy? So before we jump into the more fun stuff, I'm going to bore you with a couple of key terms and concepts. Housing is notoriously jargony, as is lots of policy areas, we realize. So just want to kind of clarify a couple of terms that you will probably hear us say and that you'll hear kind of sprinkled throughout both the data portion and the strategy discussion. So I just want to kind of level set and make sure we're kind of all on the same page about some of these terms. The first is AMI. Some of you may be very familiar with this, some of you may not. It stands for HUD Area Median Income. It is basically the mechanism by which HUD and all other housing programs income qualify people for different types of income restricted housing programs and housing services. So you hear a lot about income targets that are AMI. It generally means this is how we decide if people are considered low income and therefore qualify for certain programs and services. On this slide, you can also see, and I know this was in your packet ahead of time as well, you can see where those AMI breaks are, so what the incomes are for these different percentages of AMI. So you will commonly talk about 30, 50, 80, and 120% AMI as are really typical thresholds for where different qualifications for different programs land. Kind of just to put a little bit of kind of human perspective and job association with this, at 30% AMI, that would include folks that are in the hospitality industry or food service. That wage is typically about at or below 30% AMI. At 50% AMI, think of other professions like a childcare worker, ECE teachers, sometimes construction workers are in that 50% AMI. Sometimes they're closer to the 70 or 80, depending on what trade they're in. But that kind of skilled trade, is typically in that 50%. And when we start to bump up into 80%, you've got some other construction trades. Nursing, for example, usually falls in that 50 to 80% range. So that just gives you a little bit of flavor of kind of what we're talking about when we talk about those AMI ranges. The next jargony term that you may hear us say is missing middle. That is often associated with a certain price point. It sometimes is used as sort of middle income. When we talk about it, we mean it more from kind of the housing type or housing form. So when we talk about missing middle housing types, we're really talking about what comes in between single-family detached home and a large apartment complex. So we're typically talking about townhomes, duplexes, and that type of housing product. That typically does also have more affordability than a single-family detached, but when we use that term, we're talking about the actual form of the house, not the price point necessarily. And then finally, oh, sorry, I was going to skip maybe the most important one, which is the term affordable housing. So a lot of times we get, what does that mean? And we try to specify as we're talking about whether we're talking about naturally occurring affordable housing, and that means housing that the market is providing that is affordable to the people living in it, as opposed to income or deed restricted affordable housing, which means it has some contractual requirement to maintain affordability to a certain price point or income level. So for example, most of our capital A affordable income restricted rental housing is built through what's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC. That has to be affordable to an 80% or 60% AMI household. So naturally occurring means the market's providing it and it's affordable to those people living in it. Deed restricted or income restricted means it is contractually dedicated to a specific price point. And then finally, the geographic area of analysis. As I mentioned, Frankie's going to walk us through some data. That is all based on the jurisdictional boundaries of Inglewood. I know you all live in a place where the postal definition is much bigger than the actual city limits. When we're talking about data about Inglewood, we are talking about your jurisdictional boundaries. So just want to clarify that because I know you are adjacent to a variety of communities that may have really different demographics or housing costs. So we just want to clarify with that. So now that we've got that out of the way, the boring stuff, I'm going to hand over to Frankie, who's going to walk us through some existing conditions, talk about kind of where your needs are right now, and then we'll come back kind of toward the end of his presentation and talk through some housing strategies and toolkits.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. So before I jump in to some of the details of the existing conditions, I just want to highlight some of our top-level findings. So in Inglewood, incomes and purchasing power are not keeping up with the increase in housing prices. We found in our analysis that there are gaps in affordable units for renter households making below 30% AMI and below 50% AMI, as well as in the for sale market for potential buyers making between 30% AMI and 80% AMI. And then our third finding, we found there is capacity to have more diverse housing types. You'll see in one of the slides here, the majority of the housing stock in Inglewood is single-family detached. Just 14% of that housing stock in Inglewood is considered missing middle, just like Mollie mentioned. All right, so my first slide here is median household income. So overall, Inglewood's household median income has increased over the last 10 years, particularly over the last 5 years. We see owners are enjoying greater percentage gains in median household income compared to renters. For labor force and commuting patterns, overall in and out commuting in Inglewood is fluid due to its proximity to key job centers. We do see that there are more in-commuters. Almost a quarter of these workers are coming from the city of Denver. Of Inglewood residents, over a third are commuting to their places of employment in Denver. And then you see for 3% of those working in Inglewood, they also live within the city limits. So housing structure type. So looking at the city's housing stock, as I mentioned, the majority is single-family detached housing, which is that light blue bar right at the top. Relative to surrounding municipalities, the missing middle housing stock, again, which Mollie mentioned, is relatively limited. Attached products with 10 or more units, which is your larger multifamily housing, almost makes up a third of the housing stock in the city. And then that last 1% is mobile homes and other housing types. So some market trends. So here we see a tremendous increase in the price of rental units in Inglewood between 2010 and 2020. we can see the biggest losses here are in units that rent from between $500 to $650. And if you're looking at the figure from left to right, that second set of bars. Or the losses of those affordable units are being offset by the units priced over $1,250, with the greatest increase in units coming in at $1,500 to $2,000. So market trends in the for sale market. So similar to the rental market, the median market value of Inglewood homes has increased significantly, tripling in the last 20 years, now up to approximately $600,000 in 2022. These sharp gains have occurred primarily in the last 10 years, particularly though in the last 2 years. You see the large spike there. And median market values are slightly lower compared to most other South Metro municipalities, as well as the Denver metro area. So as I mentioned, we've seen increases in household income as well as rental and market value prices. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, those gains in median household income have not kept up with the increase in median rents or median market values. And then just a note here about this yellow call out bubble. So as we see in the table, kind of at the purchasing power increased by 90% between 2010 and 2020. And you'll note the lower interest rate there in 2020. So falling interest rates have helped to bolster affordability from 2010 to 2020. However, now that interest rates are rising again, that is compressing affordability. So if you take the current interest rate of 5% and apply that to the 2020 median income here, the affordable purchase price drops to $272,000, which is just a 51% increase in purchasing power from 2010. So affordability is not only being impacted by incomes not keeping up with the increase in housing prices, but also interest rates. And then here's I mentioned housing gaps again at the outset of the presentation. So to analyze housing gaps, we look at supply and demand by price points. The model in this first figure here, the model found gaps in the amount of rental housing units in the city that are affordable for renter households, making less than 30% AMI and less than 50% AMI, and you can see the gap numbers there. And to estimate sale market gaps, we take current renters with income between 30% and 80% of AMI and use that as a proxy for potential buyers and use it as our assumption for the demand side. And then on the supply side, we found that only 14% of current homes in Inglewood would be affordable to these renters if they were looking to buy today. And then finally, we've had several conversations with developers who work in Inglewood and the South Metro area. And here are just some of the top line themes that we've heard that we wanted to share. So on demand, the mix of the geographic location, proximity to employment, opportunities, and amenities makes Inglewood an attractive place to develop. However, there is a perception among developers that there is a limited amount of sites at a desired scale for development. Market challenges that were cited in our conversations were mostly related to costs of construction and labor, as well as availability of labor, and then escalating land prices were also cited. The number one regulatory challenge that we heard in our conversations were around parking requirements. And then overall, developers had mixed experiences with the city's entitlement process. Some felt it was efficient, some felt it was not as efficient. And overall, developers just wanted more certainty throughout the process, directly related to timing. And then finally, developers were open to incentives for affordable housing, but only if those truly offset the costs of providing that affordable housing in the development. We heard from most developers they were wary about mandatory affordable housing requirements. In addition to the costs that they were concerned about, they were also expressed some concern around operations and enforcement. So we heard a lot that their staff they don't have the staff capacity or the skills to, for example, income qualify potential tenants coming into their development. So it's very quick, but if you have any questions, happy to answer at the end. I will hand it back over to Mollie.
Thanks, Frankie. That was super helpful. So as we start thinking about some of these challenges, I mean, obviously acknowledging, as Frankie kind of showed us through the data, that you've got some affordability challenges, which is not uncommon. You know, I know that Inglewood has historically had more naturally occurring affordability than some of your surrounding communities, but I think it's pretty clear, along with many other metro jurisdictions, you're in a position where incomes are not keeping up with housing prices. That puts a burden both on kind of your economy and the people living in your community, as well as your community values around housing affordability. So seeing some clear challenges around affordability, both in the rental market, as Frankie pointed out, particularly below that 30% AMI or 50% AMI, and in the ownership or for sale market. So it's getting harder for folks, particularly that are currently renters, to convert into home ownership or to enter home ownership. So challenges on both of those fronts, rental and owner, for affordability. Also some opportunity to increase your housing diversity, particularly around those missing middle housing types, which do carry with them a little bit more naturally occurring affordability, but also just help them meet changing demand and changing needs of your existing community members. And then kind of as always with housing, you know, there are always specific or unique populations that are in need of housing support or housing stability. And so we didn't necessarily touch on that in great detail in the data analysis, but just acknowledging, you know, with an aging population, you have increased need for accessibility improvements potentially in homes, for downsizing opportunities within homes as well. And then of course, people that are experiencing homelessness, that tends to be a very kind of not just a housing situation, but specific services on that front as well. So as we start thinking about those challenges, those trends and shifts kind of in your housing market, we move into kind of the housing strategy conversation of what do we as a community or as a city leadership do about that, and how do we think about those strategies? So I'm going to give us kind of a brief overview of some typical approaches to addressing housing needs, particularly around those kind of three categories: affordability, housing diversity, and housing stability. And so I want to talk about those broadly, and then the next slide I'll just throw up kind of a toolkit of options that a lot of communities are looking at, and then we'll move into discussion to hear from you kind of what you're interested in, what you'd like more of, less of, or different. So to start with kind of your basic approaches to addressing housing needs, we kind of break these into 4 chunks that we think about, all of which require key partners to help you accomplish. We don't necessarily expect the city become a developer or become a service provider in a way that it hasn't before, but you have a great network of key partners, nonprofits, housing authority options, as well as state resources that can help partner with you. Even the market rate developers and private sector are key partners when we start talking about housing market interventions. So keeping that in mind, we don't expect you to actively do all of these, but there is a place, kind of a role for the city to move on these. So those 4 buckets that we think about for housing strategies are funding, so generate resources for affordable housing development, preservation, and services. Number 2, building, so thinking about construction, so supporting the development of both dedicated affordable housing, that's something that has an income restriction or a public subsidy with it, as well as naturally occurring affordable housing, as well as diverse housing types. So clearing the path for the market to do some of the heavy lifting for you, but then also looking at opportunities for that income restricted or dedicated affordable housing. Number 3, preserving what you already have. So we don't want you to lose the inventory of both naturally occurring as well as dedicated or income restricted affordable housing that you already have. So thinking about ways, how can we lock that in and make sure we're not losing existing assets. And then 4th and finally, assistance. So increasing access to resident housing services and programs, primarily through partnerships, funding, and potentially tailored program development. So across those 4 categories, this next slide kind of gives you more specific tools within each of those categories that can help accomplish those goals that we've talked about, or those needs, address those needs around diversity, affordability, and stability. I am happy to kind of answer more detailed questions about any of these. I'll try to just kind of run through and give you really high level, like, what is this kind of answer to get us started on the conversation, but happy to come back to that. And of course, happy to provide any additional detail as we move through this process. So to give you kind of the quick hit list here, under funding, you know, one typical tool that is used most commonly in Colorado is affordable housing linkage fee. It's also used in California and other Western states a good bit. It's basically an impact fee for affordable housing. It's done the same way. It has a nexus study, but it just associates it with housing affordability as opposed to something like roads or parks or other infrastructure. Inclusionary zoning fee in lieu. We'll talk about inclusionary zoning under the building option as well, but inclusionary zoning as a strategy can really be designed to be a funding source or a building source or a combination of both. I'll talk about that a little bit more under building. The other funding sources that we think about at the local level are all the things you traditionally think about with government funding. So sales tax, property tax, general fund dedication. You can bond on some of those as well. There's other kind of more targeted funding sources, short-term rental fees and taxes, lodging taxes, those types of things, which you can codify as directly funding housing. Under the build category, one that is really common is just a land inventory and land bank program. So what land does the city have already, or do other public entities have within the city that we might be able to repurpose to affordable housing? School district sites that are not going to develop, or RTD owns lots of property that may not become anything, or there may be other kind of public entities that own land that could be repurposed into affordable housing. So thinking about, or even mixed use housing, you obviously, next item on your agenda is city center, so you are well aware of how to leverage your existing resources for community benefit, but clearly thinking about what do we have as assets physically in the city that could be used for that. A land bank program, even more developed land banking programs typically look at funding even strategic acquisition of new land, if that's something that the city would want to consider as well. Inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning, many of you may be familiar with. It is a very hot topic in Colorado right now because it has just been kind of legalized at the state level that it is now a tool that communities can use, whereas before it was a limited tool that you could only apply to for sale properties. Now the state of Colorado said, no, if you are a local jurisdiction and you want to do that on rental, you can do it on rental and ownership. It essentially tells developers, if you're building a bunch of stuff, we'd like you to dedicate part of that to being income restricted housing at certain price points. So you have under your zoning authority the power to say that as a requirement, and that would be inclusionary housing or zoning. The way it can also be a funding strategy is you can say, instead of building your required amount, you can just give us money and we'll take care of it. So that's the way that it can also be a funding strategy. Development incentives kind of is similar in concept to inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning, except you're not making a requirement. You're just saying, instead of a stick, we'd like to use a carrot. So, hey, developers, if you want to lower your parking requirements or if you want to increase your density, we'll let you do that outside, above and beyond kind of what the code says, but you have to give us something in exchange. We'd like that to be affordable housing at certain price points. So that's the incentive approach. And then a zoning code update to reduce barriers to more diverse housing. So this is where you really are just, we're saying, look, loosen up the zoning code, change it so that the market can do some heavy lifting for you on this strategy. You're obviously working on that already with Code Next, and we're in close contact with that team. So that one you can kind of already check off as something that you're doing. I just wanted to put it up here as an acknowledgement that you're already using some of these tools in the toolkit. Shifting into preservation, first right of refusal is kind of a very common, just let's make sure that anything that has a deed restriction already, the city has the first shot to buy it back when that deed restriction expires. So you can implement that, not necessarily on stuff that is already in the inventory, but anything new. So if you impose any additional policies that might create more affordable or income restricted housing, adding on that first right of refusal so the city has access to it before it would sell and convert to market rate. Grant and low-cost loan programs to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing. So if you have kind of an apartment building that has just market rate prices but that are affordable to folks, but maybe they need some capital upgrades, there are programs where the city would come in and say, we'll give you a low-cost loan or a grant to make some improvements, necessary capital improvements, if you agree to keep your rents at this level for a certain period of time. And then funding support for nonprofit acquisition of naturally occurring affordable housing. A lot of times in those contexts, we will see a nonprofit come through and say, we're going to acquire this and keep it affordable, but they often need some gap financing to make that a reality. And so funneling city resources toward that is also a way to preserve that inventory. And then finally, in the assist bucket, key strategy here is just to make sure that your residents are aware of regional programs that already exist. In some cases, bolstering that with local resources as well, or local funding can help expand the opportunities for that. In almost all cases, those types of programs are going to have more demand than they have supply. And then maintaining partnerships with local nonprofits and other regional partners to kind of evaluate where there might be gaps in services and needs. So that's kind of the full toolkit. I'll pop back to this slide. But as you're thinking about, kind of what do you all want to see out of this housing needs assessment, out of this strategy, we just want to hear from you. What of those toolkit, what do you want more of? What do you want less of? What do you want to change? These questions are just kind of to get you thinking. We're not going to walk through systematically each of these questions, but I find it's helpful just to think about it from a couple different perspectives. What did you like? What did you not like about that list? Is there anything that makes you really nervous just in general, or that you would have concerns around implementation for? Do you see some of those as like, yeah, that's great in 15 years, or versus some that maybe are great right now? So I will spare you like making everyone answer each question, because that is not what we are here for. But we are here just to hear from you, kind of what you like, what you don't like, what you want to see more investigation on from our perspective, or as we're kind of moving through this process. So I will stop talking and let you all talk now. So thank you so much.
Ms. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Lewington, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll open up for questions for council. Member Russell.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. So my first question is, when the housing bubble pops and it collapses, does this entire study, will that change the focus of all of it?
Is a fantastic question, and certainly one that I am not, I don't have a crystal ball, like none of us do. I will say that the current dynamic in housing prices is very different fundamentally from the dynamic that we saw back in 2007, when we were literally seeing everything just sort of crumble. Foreclosures were really high. Obviously, we all lived through that, so kind of know what that was like. The fundamental difference there is that that was a very home ownership driven bubble, and there have been quite a few, of course, lending reforms that have really changed kind of the structure underneath the housing prices right now. We are obviously seeing really high prices. I think some of the steep increases we saw on the for sale side, that will mellow out a bit as we've seen interest rates go up. But that doesn't actually make things more affordable to the household that has to buy them, because it's so much costlier to finance it, right? And so we'll see the prices maybe moderate, but the actual outflow in terms of cash from a household trying to buy a house won't change that much. It'll just be now more of its interest than principal. So I don't think we're going to see the same type of bubble that we saw then. Even in 2007, like from 2007 to 2010, when we look at the kind of housing prices nationwide, we do see a big hump and then a drop. In Colorado, we don't ever see a drop. It flattened and then it went back up. And so I think that we continue to see really solid demand for housing. We continue to, and have over the past 10 years in particular, and really 15 years, underbuilt housing, and we are just still catching up, both on the rental side and on the ownership side. So all that to say, I think we could see some changes in the market. I don't think that we're going to see really massive change in affordability needs.
Okay, and then I have one other quick question, because I believe that probably in the last 6 or 7 years, the city, meaning councils, over that period of time have made decisions that I believe have impacted this. And how do we undo that? Like, I believe District 1, there have been massive duplexes built, small 800 square foot houses, no garage, no nothing. They were naturally affordable. And that's really impacted the entire housing market in Inglewood, because these duplexes sell for $750,000 a side, which is $1.5 million. They are not affordable, and it's raised the property taxes across the city and really across the state. How do you undo that? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, and I wish there was an easy answer to say that we could undo that. I think it's really hard to undo things, right? And so I think what we can do now is acknowledge, where did that go wrong, and where did we have that pressure? Did we constrain development so much that when something gets built, it has to be that high, in order to cover the cost. And I think there's some trends around labor shortages. There's a lot of market factors that are driving some of those construction prices up. But I certainly think that there's not a silver bullet to solving any of these housing challenges, right? And there's not going to be a solution that is just public sector driven. There's not going to be a solution that is just private sector driven. So there's no way that the market will fully solve this problem. There's no way that government will fully solve this problem. So we need to look at ways to both make it more affordable for private construction to happen, and to happen in a way that doesn't have to result in a $750,000 townhome or duplex. But we also have to look at the reality that the market is not going to produce housing that meets the needs across that income spectrum.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Thank you. I think I saw Member Anderson's light first, and then Member Wink.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I had one question on the slides here, the median household income slide, where it showed a 41% increase of the income for owners as opposed to renters, which is just kind of a straight line there. Is that because incomes are really going up for homeowners, or is that actually an effect of the increased housing prices? I'm trying to understand that a little better.
Great question. It's a mix of things. So it's really hard for us to know exactly what's driving that. But the data seem to indicate that existing owners do have their incomes going up. And we know that in general, the economic recovery over the past 10 years has favored folks that are in white-collar jobs who are likely owners already. So we do think, yes, owners' incomes are going up. However, the other thing that's happening is that renters are staying renters longer. So you have fewer in that kind of lower to middle income category jumping into ownership. And so we're kind of isolating owners. So the existing owners are staying owners, and their incomes are going up. The kind of balancing act that usually means lower or high income renters who are would be low income owners jumping into that category, that would bring that average down or that median down, but that's not happening. And instead your home ownership rate is actually going down a little bit.
Yeah, I know that taking this information and kind of some of our demographic studies that we've done with our surveys over the years, seeing that 50% of our population has turned over in the last 8 years might account for a good portion of that. If housing prices are going up, wealthier people are moving in and buying those houses. So I don't know. I'm just curious about that. Okay, that's.
Member Wink.
Thank you, Mayor. Here I am with my allergies again. Thanks, folks, for being here tonight. Back on your slide regarding that you spoke to, not Frankie, I can't remember your name. I could look it up, but the one titled Strategic Approaches to Housing, to Address Housing Needs. When you spoke about stability and the aging population or the above adult population, and some of the needs to modify housing as time goes on, I would kind of like to know, whether it's tonight or later, a little bit more of what happens there, of those scenarios, and where those populations, just what the scenarios look like. And by knowing that, understanding how the city can anticipate or sort of get in front of some of those maybe less desirable situations. Thanks.
Great. So we can add more detail about that in our report. So that's super helpful. I can give you kind of a quick response now to a couple things that we typically see. The vast majority of folks who are aging and have lived in their home for a long time would like to stay there. That's what survey after survey after survey showed, right? So we don't expect that population to say, I want to live somewhere totally different. Certainly some population will. So what we typically recommend for communities is to think about what supports might they need to stay in their home as long as possible. That typically includes access to medical care, but it also means modifications to homes, right? So ramps, supporting those types of kind of accessibility improvements. There are state programs that help fund that. There are others, but it's really helpful when the city can help provide resources around that, know what those programs are, and know where to get those dollars to help make those modifications. So physical modifications is important. The other thing that is also important is flexibility in living arrangements. So the kind of classic example is the Golden Girls situation, right? Which is, to be perfectly honest, illegal in most communities because it's unrelated occupants sharing a home. And so thinking about what are our occupancy limits, and is that helpful? Is that not helpful? How are we accommodating some alternative living situations? Other things, thinking about flexibility is also, for example, ADUs on a property. So caretaker type properties, types of arrangements that allow more flexibility in the way that people live and the way that people function, in addition to those physical modifications of homes themselves.
Thank you very much.
Member Woodward.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have a couple questions. One would be the federal government in Section 8 vouchers, which if you look for a Section 8 voucher now, it's years out, and people are literally years in line, if they can get in line. Do you see the federal government doing anything, HUD changing any of that, making any more available?
Short answer, there's not a real clear indication that they will be doing more of that or that will increase. I think, there are some movements to expand some housing provision at the federal level, but the historical trend over the past 10 years has been a decline in federal funding for housing for the most part. So we're seeing more and more states stepping in, local jurisdictions stepping in and saying, this is not solving the problem. What else can we do? I think that, so short answer, no, I don't think that that's going to increase in terms of federal resources toward housing. We are seeing the state increase some resources for housing. And so obviously being mindful of that as a city and saying, what can we leverage from state resources is really important. But I don't see a real clear indication that the federal government's going to add vouchers or housing to that.
Okay.
That could change at any time. But
my next question has to do with, and it kind of comes back to what Member Russell was talking about, the duplexes that were going in District 1. However, I see there could be opportunities for things like fourplexes and possibly lower and higher as far as elevation goes on height. And they don't have to be as high end as the ones that were going at $750,000 up to $999, I think. To get some bigger families, lower, more moderate type incomes. Are we looking at that at all in planning?
yeah, so I would say there's kind of two ways to look at that. One is to say, do we have a zoning code that allows those types of structures to be built kind of in a wide variety of areas? And do we have a process that signals to developers, this is going to be easy. You can move through this quickly. So on the one hand is let's make sure that our zoning code supports development that might be more naturally affordable than like a large lot, large single family home. So that's one side to making it kind of market, letting the market kind of build to that need. The other side is to say, look, the market's going to be building $750,000 duplexes. And so if we really want to ratchet that down to a really affordable level that the market's not going to provide, then your strategies are more along the lines of what incentives can we offer developers to say, you can build this. For example, if you're building in particular, let's say you're building 10 townhomes, we're going to let you have even smaller lots or, give you more variances on setbacks. Or something to that extent. If you make one of those affordable to a middle income household, if you say that's going to be to 100%, 120% AMI. So having some deed restriction or designation on that, either through an incentive or mandatory requirement like an inclusionary zoning or something like that. So both requirements, like free up your zoning code, acknowledging that's not going to move us back necessarily in time to everything that's built is going to be affordable to middle income, but acknowledging there are some ways to do that contractually as well through incentives or other mechanisms.
Mayor Pro Tem, and then I'll ask a question after the Mayor Pro Tem.
One of the challenges I've heard about recently is when somebody goes to sell a house, there's a long line of investors with armloads of cash who are looking to acquire these properties, cash offer, and convert them to rentals. And that makes a challenge for someone who's trying to enter the single family market to buy their house. Are you aware of any policies that can be adopted to discourage or incentivize actual owner occupancy of properties that go up for sale?
So yes and no. I'll say no to the regulating kind of, if somebody already owns a property and they want to sell it, you can't control who they sell it to, right? There's not a good way to do that, even in terms of like, we've had clients ask, well, can we just say, well, you have to like list it differently or take these offers? There's really just not a clean way to do that for an existing home that is already owned. On the other hand, we've talked a lot about kind of income restrictions and affordability restrictions when the city puts something into it. So when the city says we give you a zoning incentive or we're telling you you have to do this, the city can then regulate incomes. In the same way, if the city is offering something to the developer and the city has kind of a stake in it, it's city on land, or you give an incentive, then you can say, we'd like to, instead of income restricting this, just owner occupy restrict this. So where you see this most commonly is in mountain communities, resort communities in our mountains. They have entire neighborhoods sometimes that have some city investment, and in exchange for that city investment, the city says, this is a locals neighborhood. That makes it sound a little bit exclusive, but it is. It's designed to be for their workforce, and in those restrictions in the mountains, you often see a actual like employment restriction. You have to be employed either part-time or full-time in the community. You can do some owner occupancy restrictions, but again, only for properties in which the city has some influence over it. So it's city on land, or there's an incentive or something like that. So all I have to say, you can't control kind of what already exists, but you can think about owner occupancy restrictions either in conjunction with an income restriction or separate from an income restriction.
Thank you. The other question I have is, I guess, more philosophical in nature. I represent Council District 4, and when I have conversations with my constituents, increasing density is a big issue. So I guess the overarching question I have is, for the people who are already in their homes and they own their homes and they're well established in the community, why should they care about this? Why does it matter?
Yeah, it's a great question and certainly philosophical. And the reality is, this is a community value question. There's no objective statement that says you have to care about this as a community. I would say it is not just about housing affordability. It is really about a community identity. So it certainly impacts the types of jobs you can attract. It certainly impacts the types of services that may be available. And it does have an economic impact on your community as well. So the more expensive housing is, the more people are spending on their housing, the less they're spending on other goods and services in your community. So there is an economic development component to this, which is real, but there is also just a community value question. People are constantly weighing the trade-offs, and do I want to commute further and live somewhere that's maybe farther away and a little bit more less expensive? But the reality is it comes down to, do we want to have a community that allows kind of a full life cycle for folks? Do we offer a place for folks that are just getting out of high school or just getting out of college? Do we offer a place for growing families? Do we offer a place for folks that are increasing their incomes? Do we offer a place for folks that are looking to downsize or that may be on a fixed income? So it's really kind of about that life cycle. And we see healthier economies and healthier communities when you have kind of a balance of housing, but it's not a requirement. I would say on the density front, that is always a challenge. And I think as we think about these, and the benefit of doing this along with a land use code change is that we can talk about what do we value in terms of housing, but also where do we value that? Physically, yes, there may be places where we can increase density in really, really gentle ways. So maybe we're still talking about single family homes, but we're talking about smaller lots, patio homes, right? And there may be other places where we say, no, we're willing to add some height along corridors, and that's fine. And so it really is about balancing that, but also being, I think, realistic in that there are trade-offs, right? We can't have all the things we want. We can't have super low density and also be able to walk to a coffee shop, right? Like those are incongruent. And so just thinking about those trade-offs, and it's hard to think about when you've been in a neighborhood that long, but I think that's where we talk about really gentle. Do we allow an accessory dwelling unit, or do we allow sort of non-family occupancy, like Golden Girls style situation, right? Do we allow slightly smaller lot sizes or patio homes? So it's all incremental.
That's helpful. Thank you. Lastly, I'll just say in response to your questions, I think the best answer I can give you at this point is I favor the carrot, not the stick. So you can chalk me up as a carrot guy.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ms. Fitzpatrick, thank you for that. I think you started touching on one of my questions and just comments. So when we go back 3 slides from this, where it's the market perspective from local developers, that first bullet, demand, where developers are saying that there's a limited number of sites for desired scale, are they talking about the affordable housing, the missing middle? So are they talking about, some of our zoning may not allow for ADUs or cottages or tiny homes, or for the missing middle, just fourplexes, bungalow, courtyards, that type of thing? Is that what they're talking of, or are they talking about something different?
Great question. And yes, we heard that from a wide variety of developers. So some who were affordable, some who were more higher end multifamily, and some who were townhome or lower scale development. So we heard, look, and the reality is we're always going to hear from developers. We'd like to build whatever we want, wherever we want. So certainly there's going to be some of that. But we did hear from folks, look, I would be building different product if I was allowed to do that. And not in super dramatic, like I would be building 20 stories. It was, I would be building townhomes in more locations, or I would be building smaller lot homes in some locations. And certainly some locations, I would be building, higher, potentially slightly higher apartment buildings along corridors or near the hospital. Some of those markets do have some of that demand, but I would say this was more about kind of that more gentle scale that we were talking about.
Right, and when they're saying this, they're saying it built by right, right? So not having to go through the process, or
yes, of course, yep. They're talking about by right. What can I build by right? Because developers, the process is always of key concern to developers. They want to move through quick. They just want transparency, right? And so it doesn't even have to be, you have to give me this with no strings attached. It's just, I want to know what my options are. And so, a lot of times we hear from developers, particularly as communities start to get interested in affordable housing, and maybe they're negotiating a lot of affordable housing in different deals. Developers are always going to want you to tell them how high they have to jump. So you can tell me I need to jump, but I need to know how high. How much do you want? Where is it? And what do I get? So a lot of transparency, even around, kind of a carrot approach, being transparent about what those carrots are and what you're going to get in exchange. And certainly with a large redevelopment, it's always going to be a negotiation, right? You're in process with that obviously right now with City Center, and thinking about what are we asking for, what are we getting, what are we contributing. That's kind of a different echelon. We're really talking about even like slightly larger redevelopment, but primarily in kind of one-off developments, knowing what they're going to get.
Right. Thank you. More questions, but I'll pass it over to Member Anderson, then Member Wink.
Thank you. I just wanted to weigh in on some of these questions and the housing toolkit ideas that you have here. To me, I think the biggest need that we have is just more housing across the board. Just a supply. We have a supply problem, and I'm not even all that concerned with seeing new high-end housing, because if there's a demand for it out there, then we need that too. And those are people who then aren't bidding on something down the line. So you have kind of a filtering effect on the housing. So I would love to see more missing middle, allowances for missing middle. I know we've talked about this with our Code Next update a few weeks ago, but I'm wondering if we don't need to consider, some broader upzoning kind of changes to allow for some of those duplexes and triplexes in areas that they've never really been legal before. Really thinking more strategically about how can we increase that supply, whether it's whether it's just strictly low income housing or even higher higher income housing. I think we need all of it, and so that to me puts a lot of the burden on the zoning code. I think the parking requirement concern, that makes a lot of sense. If they got to, if a developer has to come in and then dedicate 1.5 parking spots for every unit, that takes up land that apartments could otherwise that could otherwise be built as apartments. And so I just think more supply. What can we do with our zoning to make that happen? And then specifically on the concern about the by right apartment built, like I would love to see developers they come into Inglewood and they go, oh, I can build apartments right here. I don't have to go through the big process. It's already laid out. I can do it by right. I'd like to see us taking some of those plots of land, especially near light rail station, down by Oxford light rail station as well, and just making those by right apartment, multifamily, larger units, and then also aim for some of that missing middle in some of our residential areas that where it's currently not legal. There's no place where it's really legal to build a triplex in Inglewood that I know of. We need to fix that. And to that end, like I'm all about affordable housing. I have big concerns about the idea of inclusionary zoning, because what's a developer going to do if they come in and they're trying to make money in Inglewood and they say, well, I have to dedicate such and such a percent to affordable housing? They're going to say, okay, how expensive do I have to make the remainder of my units to make up for these units? And so you end up again losing the middle by requiring that putting that affordable housing requirement on there. So I would, I'd be okay with some incentives, some smaller incentives, but nothing that makes a developer go, oh, stay out of Inglewood. That's the other thing I think could happen is we have inclusionary zoning and they go, oh, well, I guess we're not going to build there. We're looking for places where we can build without having to go through that process. So big hesitations from my end on the inclusionary zoning. But in terms of the zoning code to just allow us to increase supply across the board, count me in.
Thank you, Member Anderson. Member Wink.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm actually going back to that slide I like with I think the toolkit strategies. Is that what it was titled? Because if memory serves appropriately, I feel as if the conversation tends that I've had or experienced as a council member here tends to resonate around the number one. And I really love, I would really love to hear more about the others. So not just what I asked about previously. And I think that even Member Russell's comment about the plethora of twin homes in District 1 that are 762,000, etc. It's her concern, I believe, and a way to sort of address what she was asking is exactly also what Member Anderson was just mentioning about exploring some of those other options to maybe develop in different zoning considerations and build different types of duplexes, etc. What did you call the diversity of the housing options? I think that's a big one to dig into as well for Inglewood in terms of what we can consider and what we can pose to this council that the seven of us might agree on, that our team of experts on our administrative staff would agree with or want to support, and that citizens would also be thankful for. So yeah, I really love this slide. I think it's pretty key in terms of what we need. Not that we want to ignore number one, but we really, those final 3 points are valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wink. Member Russell.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I, just in response to what Councilmember Wink just said about the duplexes, I really think the duplexes, especially in District 1, what the people are upset about in most of the conversations I've had are the massive size. They're not upset that there's a duplex there. if they would have been built more in the character of the neighborhood, and plus they would have been more affordable had they been built in that character. I do want to be careful about changing zoning. We bought 26 years ago in R1A. I expect the zoning to stay R1A because that's why we bought there, was to protect the value of that. I do know one thing that has happened. Almost every home we live on Dartmouth Circle, almost every home has been remodeled in the last 2 or 3 years. And there were a couple people that were looking for a bigger house, couldn't find one because they disappeared. They ended up adding to their home. So in some of the areas, that's, for that. The one question that I have, and this is a kind of a current problem, Traditions is a low income, I don't think they're 30%. I think they're higher than that. It's a senior living. And I know even 4 or 5 years ago, people were calling me that every year they'd get their evaluation and the rent would get raised. And someone called and left me a message today that their rent is going up $200. And when you're a senior living on fixed income and you're already paying $1,100 or $1,200, I know that with Traditions, there were they signed an agreement with the Housing Authority to take HUD people. But if something happened and those HUD people left, then they didn't refill those spots. You know what I'm saying? So, and that was an agreement in exchange for tax incentives. How do we hold them accountable to fulfill the obligation that they have? I mean, I don't think it's just that person gets to move in and then your requirement is gone. So what are things that we can do to help those people?
Yeah, so not knowing the specifics of the agreement there, I can't necessarily speak to exactly what's happening there, but certainly there are contractual ways that you can obligate kind of the permanence of those arrangements, right? And so that has a lot to do both with how that contract is written with that actual provider or that apartment complex. Yes, there's certainly ways to do that. It does require some staff capacity to make sure that those are being enforced, right? So there's kind of two sides of that. One is, did we ensure that upfront? And number two is, are we checking and enforcing to make sure that is still happening? Yes, there are certainly ways to do that. Almost all affordability agreements do have like a term over which it is valid, right? So some of those tend to be relatively short, 15 years. Some are long, 30 years, 40 years, 199 years is kind of the longest that you get. So yes, it's just about designing those contracts appropriately and then making sure they're enforced.
Thank you very much.
Member Woodward.
Thank you. Just in addressing some of what Member Russell brought up about those neighborhoods in District 1, I remember going back years when we were discussing specifically that and improving that housing stock. A lot of it was built in the 1920s, 1930s. It was supporting General Iron and the housing need there. 800 feet, 2-bedroom, 1 bath, very small houses. And I think what I'm seeing or hearing people, and they're usually people that have lived here a long time, that have a history here, the design standard that they're seeing is different. It isn't in, quote, the character of the neighborhood. However, it is in the character of the 22nd century. And 2022, that's the norm. I heard people complaining about houses that had flat roofs. That didn't they know that those weren't going to work and that they were going to leak and all kinds of things? Well, they don't leak. And every office building downtown Denver has a flat roof. So it's modern construction, but I think those types, we've got to do some educating of our citizens that things change, and certainly housing models change. The 50s were different, the 70s and 80s were different, and now we're in the 21st century. So just a comment.
Thank you, Member Woodward. Just a couple questions. Hopefully they're quick answers, but I don't think you touched on it in the presentation, but is there any type of incentives, or what can we, between the discrepancy for rent or for sale by developers, is there anything that we could do as a city in order to get them to do for sale versus the for rent?
Not directly, other than kind of thinking about the balance of housing types that you're allowing. So obviously, an apartment complex, something that's zoned multifamily is most likely to be rental, something that's zoned for something else. But it's hard as a city to control that, again, unless you are directly influencing the development through some type of agreement or through some type of incentive or that sort of thing. So only if the city has a stake.
Okay. And then second question is, and I'm in agreement with Member Anderson on this, where I just think that we need to open up the supply to kind of bring the costs down. Because I think that some of what we're seeing today is just the fact that we haven't been building to keep up with population increases. So I guess my question then is, going back to the affordable housing piece, because I would prefer to go down the supply side, but I'm just wondering, does the market ever provide affordable housing without a carrot?
Short
Or
answer
a
is
stick.
no, unless it's a nonprofit organization that it is in their mission to do so. So the other way to think about that, if you're saying, look, we want to unlock supply, is also thinking about ways to be very hospitable to organizations that are mission driven. So identifying those and building relationships with those, acknowledging that you may be willing to make different incentives available when it's an entire development that is likely to be, sort of majority affordable, or something like that. So thinking about kind of Habitat for Humanity, other community land trusts like Elevation Community Land Trust, or other builders that are kind of working on that mission-driven scale. That's the only time when the market is going to provide that, and typically those developers are going to need some kind of subsidy. It may come from an outside source, right? In the case of Habitat, they have a lot of philanthropic donations, labor, that kind of thing. So the short answer is no, but there are folks out there that are doing that kind of thing. And so making sure that you've got kind of a scenario or an open door to those organizations is one way to help kind of draw that.
Perfect. Thank you. So just last thing, and I'll let my colleagues finish off, but in terms of your questions, I think it's very timely. I actually wish that you were here a couple years back or 3 years back so we could kind of see some of the examples that we should be considering. In terms of where I stand, I'm mostly in agreement with Member Anderson. I think just we need to increase the supply, make it as easy to build in the city as possible. I want to see diversity of housing. Some of the things that I was talking about earlier were townhomes, the missing middle aspect of it, where what we don't see in the city anymore. Bungalows, tiny homes, that would be more on the affordable side. But I would love to see all those options available to developers. I would also consider upzoning, although I don't like the timing of it here in the moment in terms of where we are with Code Next. But that would be something I would be open to, just because I think we have to consider everything, I guess, in a sense. So that's where I stand. So I'll leave it to my colleagues. I think Member Anderson, you're next. So go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on that exchange on whether developers provide affordable housing, because I think you're right in a sense that any developer is going to come in and try to maximize the amount of money they make off a project, and I don't fault them for that. Right? That's the business they're in. When I go out and try to make money, I want to make the most money per hour I can. It makes sense, but I do think there are some housing forms that actually maximize their value at lower income scale. So if they can come in on a lot and build a quadplex, I think that's a good example, because you might be able to get really high-end duplexes on a normal size Inglewood lot. You're not going to get really high-end houses in a quadplex. There's just not enough space on the lot, and so those are going to be naturally more affordable. ADUs are the same thing. You know, if we allow for basement conversion ADUs, those are going to be naturally affordable because they're in a basement, and and rich people don't want to live in basements. It's, you know, so it's, I mean, it's just reality, you know. And then the other kind of long-term thing is as the mayor was saying, increasing supply does increase affordable housing if you think really long term. And I do think we need to think both short term, how do we incentivize some affordable housing in the short term, but also in the really long term. We have a broken system across the country, and we are not making enough housing because it's overregulated. It's overregulated because we have zoning requirements that don't allow us to build enough housing to keep up with the market. And so it's not directly building, you know, a developer's not going out and directly building affordable housing, but whatever they build, if we build enough of it, is going to become affordable in the future. So just opening up those options, I think, is important. So thank you. I'll quit now.
Thank you, Member Anderson. I know that we could probably speak about this for another hour or so, but anything else from council? I don't see any further questions. Mr. Lewington, thank you very much for the data, for the presentation. This was great. Ms. Fitzpatrick, very lively conversation. I really enjoy it. So we have another one coming up. So I really appreciate your time tonight, and thank you again for being here tonight.
Great. Thank you all so much. Sorry for running long while the Broncos were playing.
No, we enjoyed it on our side. Thank you so much. Council, we're going on to the second agenda item unless anyone needed to take a break, but don't see anybody needing a break. So we'll move on to Community of Development, Director of Community Development, Brad Power, Chief Redevelopment Officer, Dan Poremba, and Arleen Taniwaki, if I pronounced that correctly. Principal at ArLand Land Use Economics, here to present about the City Center Redevelopment Economic Impact Report. Good evening, Mr. Poremba. Not yet. I don't think it's on. Is there a light on that thing? Okay.
He needs a microphone for the record.
For members on YouTube that are listening in. Hold on 1 second.
Okay. Oh, yeah. How easy. Okay. That was easy. Thank you. This item is a quick update on city center redevelopment with, as Sean mentioned, most of the impact, actually, as you mentioned, Mayor, most of the impact on the recent fiscal and economic impact study by ArLand. Land Use Economics presented by Arleen Taniwaki. But before Arleen summarizes the economic impact report, I just want to give you a brief update on progress for city center redevelopment. As of last week, SKB, Triba, and LNR partners finally formalized and agreed to a purchase and sale agreement pertaining to all of the former Weingarten property. And so this is a really, really big deal. The only thing, we're about another week away from full execution of that agreement between SKB and LNR. But they've agreed to the contract, and it needs a final formal approval from LNR. The framework agreement between the city, EAF, and LNR will define the steps to terminate the ground lease on the former Weingarten property and transfer that property to SKB Triba. And this really will allow the vision that was defined in 2018 when that property, the former Weingarten property, was foreclosed on. It will allow that property and the city-owned property at City Center, which is the property in blue. You'll remember the Weingarten property is the property in red on that site plan that we've seen very many times. But it'll allow those two properties to be redeveloped in an integrated fashion, by one master developer to achieve a larger, more impactful, sustainable, and near-term redevelopment. So this is really like the vision that we had talked about 4 years ago unfolding. Contingent on successful negotiations, the framework agreement with L&R will be brought to you for your consideration later in 2022. And then just to give you an overall framework, SKB and Triba's purchase of the former Weingarten property is targeted to close during the first quarter of 2024. The execution of the master development agreement is expected to occur in late 2023, following and subject to obviously approval by the EDDA board and city council. So the focus of the fiscal and economic impact study was to evaluate the financial impacts of redeveloping city center core area, and it's in specific relationship to approximately $50 million in private capital that is projected to be provided by the master developer, SKB Triba, plus the public investment and financing required to make redevelopment economically feasible. So we'll go through that in later stages, but City Council will have the right to not only approve the master development agreement, but a number of financing agreements that are all part of that. So I'll turn it over to Arleen, but she was engaged by SKB Triba and the city with the goal of preparing a fiscal and economic study of the redevelopment of City Center, and specifically looked at, you'll remember, the redevelopment plan that was presented to council in April of this year at the April 11th study session. So the hope was that the economic impact report should inform council and the public at large about the various impacts of redeveloping City Center. And so to summarize that report, here's Arleen.
Good evening, Mayor and members of council. Arleen Taniwaki with ArLand Land Use Economics. We have been in business since about 2005. I have over 25 years of experience, but what we do in the Denver metro area is we provide economic, market, and financial analysis for cities throughout the region and businesses in real estate, land use, and transportation. We've worked previously in the city of Englewood on the Next Step study that happened several years ago, the Downtown Vision Plan or the Downtown Plan of Development for the EDDA. Other economic impact studies that we've conducted included a larger study for the Denver International Airport, as well as some smaller studies in Centennial, Aurora, and Lakewood. And then finally, we have fairly considerable experience in transit-oriented development studies and plans for just a wide variety of cities in the Denver metro region, specifically those that are sort of first-ring suburbs around the city of Denver. We also currently office at the Cobalt Workspace, which is at Floyd and Broadway, which is literally just a couple of blocks away. So we do experience this area on a somewhat daily basis. And so the way this presentation is structured is I'm going to start out with a summary, and then I'm going to go through some definitions of terms, go through some of the detail because there's a lot of numbers here and it's just easy to get lost with all of this, and then talk a bit about the case studies we looked at. So overall, big picture economic and fiscal impacts, this is kind of our summary number for the city center core. So we're defining the city center core as that SKB Triba area that Dan just referred to. It's the city center area. It also includes the Weingarten properties, and it's that redevelopment that you have been learning about, I guess, over the past few months. We've estimated that the net present value of that redevelopment is about $430 million to $660 million. That's over 30 years. And so how we calculate that, it's basically a combination of fiscal impacts. So fiscal impacts are defined as basically fees and taxes that come to the city of Englewood. And so here they're comprised of one-time fees for construction, like building permits and that type of thing, as well as annual property taxes and sales taxes and those types of things, lodging taxes that come annually to the city of Englewood. So that's your fiscal impact. And then we also have our economic impact. And so real simply, that just includes jobs, households, as well as visitors. And so this development is anticipated to bring a lot of that type of new activity to the area. But what we did in order to calculate that net present value is to calculate or estimate what their local expenditures would be. So it would be from, new employees who are eating lunch in the area to new households, what they spend locally in Englewood, as well as visitors and what they spend locally. So essentially, to come up with that big number that we have here, we added up that construction-related fee number along with that annual tax and fee number, along with that the local expenditures. We ran that out. We added those together. We ran that out 30 years, and then we discounted it in order to bring that future number to present day numbers. And the discount rate, we went through a lot of sort of detail in the report, but that discount rate is basically a number that the Office of Management and Budget in Washington, the OMB, uses to estimate the value of public infrastructure projects. So essentially, we use the same discount rate, which is how we came up with this overall net present value. So additionally, we also calculated the multiplier impacts on adjacent properties and the region. And so the assumption is that the city center core, which is the SKB Triba redevelopment, helps to catalyze adjacent redevelopment and investment. And so that results in new households and visitors that spend on local goods and services. They hire new employees who spend locally. There's an increase in just business-to-business transactions, and all of this activity helps create more demand for new businesses, new services, et cetera. And so, and all of that sort of multiplier impact can be estimated. There's models out there. The U.S. government actually does sort of track all of this, but what we used is a case study impact from Denver Union Station, which essentially said in the Denver metro region that a development of this type would have an average multiplier of about 1.7. And what that means is that the one part of this is the city center core. It's the SKB Triba piece of it, and the 0.7 is sort of that additional economic impact as a result of that initial development. So that's how that number is calculated. And then we also did calculate out what all of that would mean to the city of Englewood, and these numbers are very, very long term. I'll go into detail about these later, but essentially they do fall into that category of fiscal impacts and economic impacts. So it's sort of the same thing that what we discussed earlier. So, and this is a reminder to all of you about the city center core redevelopment. This is the SKB Triba plan, and essentially the uses are listed above. There are a number of new residential units, over 1,000 overall, a portion of which are affordable. There's a long desired hotel in the center of that area. And so as you can see, we've got the RTD, the rail line station, and we've got Hampton there on the top, which is to the north of this redevelopment. We've got some office also in the center along Hampton. Retail and restaurant uses are scattered throughout that redevelopment. We've got a new city hall, and we've also got some cultural uses as well that are interspersed through that development area. We also have some structured parking, but it's about a 2 million square foot redevelopment with over 1,000 housing units intended to be developed over the next 7 years or so. My understanding of the schedule is correct. And so in the report, we also talked about first and second tiers. And so the city center core is in green. That's the SKB Triba redevelopment. That's kind of the main redevelopment that we're focusing on, so that's why we called it core. And then we have a first tier area, which is right adjacent to the core area, and that's in orange. And the assumption with the first and second tier is that these areas are going to redevelop more quickly and at higher densities than would otherwise occur without that city center core area redeveloping. So it's an example of your multiplier impact. And so that first tier that's kind of to the bottom and to the left, that's something that's occurring now. My understanding is that there's apartments and townhomes in that area currently being developed. That first tier area right in the middle, that's Englewood Plaza and Englewood Marketplace. That's Hobby Lobby, the Dollar Tree and Big Lots. And these property owners, in the context of the Next Steps plan, actually indicated that they would be interested in redevelopment, but they didn't want to be the first one sort of taking that risk and coming out of the gate. And so they have indicated an interest in redevelopment. It also includes the Chase parking lot as well. The second tier is a little more, it's not specifically defined. Essentially what it is, it's the areas adjacent to the first tier as well as the core. It includes the area south of Hamden. It potentially goes into the commercial areas along Broadway. These areas, and actually all of this is, we use fuzzy lines here, but it's to indicate that they're not specifically defined. It's sort of this general area that we're talking about. So if there's some redevelopment further afield that is a result of that city center core, that's perfectly appropriate as well. We just wanted to give an example of what that could look like because as we show in the case studies, a lot of times when you see that initial redevelopment and then there's subsequent redevelopment, it tends to be geographically close. So I wanted to go through some of the definitions in terms of what specifically we're talking about and, some of the sources that we used. For economic impacts, we did talk about the one-time impacts and then ongoing impacts. And in each situation, I'll be talking about both. But your one-time economic impacts are from construction, and that typically occurs one time at the very beginning. You're building an apartment building like once. So that includes cost of materials. We got those construction estimates from the development team. Jobs, payroll, and local spending. That information came from Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers from the U.S. Department of Labor. So we got some information directly from the development team, but what we then did is we used just general sort of factors and criteria in order to develop our own sets of numbers about what the impact would be. Fees for architects, engineering, and financial services. There's typical ratios that developments use to architects estimate their fees based on they know that a particular project will be valued at this X amount of construction dollars. They sort of estimate their fees based on that. And so those numbers are generally known, so we use the same set of numbers. There are also ongoing economic impacts, and again, this is a result of the jobs, households, and visitors. So if you just keep those three sort of categories in mind, basically it comes down to new employees and their spending both locally and regionally. We did make some assumptions about the types of jobs and then the salaries that people earn, and they're based on Denver Metro averages. Household spending, the spending numbers and incomes are based on what estimated rent levels would be, and then also on how people spend their money. Typically, there's surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics undertakes to understand, like, you spend X amount of money on groceries or on general merchandise or at restaurants. So there's a general sort of idea, a guideline that we followed there. Visitor spending, the spending on lodging, restaurants, and services. the state of Colorado does a pretty significant amount of surveying about visitors and what they spend, and essentially what we did is we used that information to come up with those estimates. Fiscal impacts, very important for the city of Englewood overall. It's basically your sales, it's basically sales taxes, property taxes, and the like. And part of this comes directly to the city of Englewood, and in this case, part of this would also go to the EDDA, or the increment would go to the EDDA. So your one-time taxes, these are all related to construction. Your use taxes are based on your construction cost materials, the cost of materials used in construction. And we made those estimates based on what the development team told us. We also interviewed some of the staff in terms of what portion of that would be taxed. Indirect sales taxes are based on employees when they're constructing locally. They also eat lunch and spend locally as well. There's some surveys that we use to help generate those estimates. Plan review and building permit, there's a fee schedule for that. We talked to the staff person who's in charge in order to help make those estimates for those portions of the fiscal impacts. And then on an ongoing basis, you have real property taxes. That's, you have mill levies, and assessors rates that we use. We use the prevailing rates and mill levies. Personal property taxes are for equipment. And so, a lot of businesses have equipment. Those are also taxed. We did incorporate an estimate of that. Sales taxes based on just sales at restaurants and retailers and the prevailing sales tax rate in the city of Englewood. Indirect sales taxes from people eating who are working here, and the sales taxes that are generated from their expenditures at restaurants and the like. And then lodging taxes, you do have a lodging tax rate that we did directly incorporate. And then finally, the multiplier impacts, and just going into this in a little more detail. Again, that's your first and second tier areas. It's not your direct city center core area, but essentially what it is, it's an enumeration of the relationships that households, visitors, and businesses have throughout the Denver metro area. And so essentially the Denver metro area is the universe that we looked at, but what it does, it helps enumerate some of those business relationships. And so essentially what happens is that the businesses, residents, and visitors, their spending circulates dollars throughout the economy. It comes back into the economy. And what that multiplier effect that we mentioned previously, that 1.7 number, does, it measures the impact of that initial activity at the city center and a core on the local and regional economy. So going back, and I know this is a lot of numbers, but for the core, so we really did focus on that SKB Triba area, and that's the core. So the economic impact, again, that's the construction, the jobs, household, and visitors. The construction estimate's about $490 million, and that's in today's dollars. We're estimating about over 1,000 new households. They're going to spend in the region about $62 million. We're estimating about $10 million of that will be spent in the city of Englewood, primarily on general merchandise. The Walmart's right there. You've got retail and restaurant spending that people tend to spend more locally than in other categories. We've got net new jobs, and so in this case, there are jobs on that site already. We subtracted that out. We have an estimate of new jobs. We subtracted out existing jobs, and we estimate earnings of about $12 million, with a small portion of that it's really for lunch and some smaller expenditures overall. And then there is a hotel that is being planned for this area. We're estimating about 36,000 visitors annually, and that these visitors would spend about $25 million overall, and that a big chunk of that would stay in Englewood. So the fiscal impact for the core, again, that's the SKB Triba area, is on a one-time basis, and these are the taxes that come from use taxes, the sales taxes, plan review, and building permit. About $10.9 million of that would be for the city of Englewood. And then on an ongoing annual basis, about 2.6 million of that would come to the city of Englewood. A portion of that, again, the increment would potentially would go to the EDDA, which has a very concerted focus on that downtown area. So these numbers, that economic and fiscal impact number, form the basis for that net present value of the 430 to 660 million, just focused on the SKB Triba area. We also estimated the core first and second tier economic impacts, so it's for this entire area overall. It's not something that's going to happen right away. I mean, this could take maybe, decades, and I think the case studies that we will show will demonstrate that it does take a long time. And so on a one-time construction basis for your economic impacts, we're looking at 830 million, and that's in today's dollars. Potentially over 2,000 new households overall that will spend about 20 million in local retail and restaurant expenditures. Net new jobs about 825, with $1 million in local retail and restaurant expenditures. And then new visitors, we're assuming another hotel in this area generating about 64,000 visitors annually, with 35 million in local expenditures. And then a fiscal impact estimate for that entire area, about on a one-time basis, the direct use taxes as well as building permit fees and plan review estimated at 18.5 million, and then on an ongoing annual basis about 4.8 million for that entire area. So I'm going to switch gears right now and just talk about the case studies that we undertook. We looked at 3 of them, and our criteria included they had to be transit-oriented developments, public-private partnerships, special districts had to be involved, whether it was an urban renewal area or whether it was a downtown development authority or a metropolitan district. Tax increment financing was a big part of the case studies and whether or not we looked at them. And we also wanted to make sure that we looked at the Denver metro region. So the first case study is Denver Union Station. You're all familiar with this. It is a complex redevelopment, public-private partnerships. In this case, there were multiple authorities and districts to finance and represent different interests. And if you read that, there was a lot of, it went back past decades. There were a number of different efforts to get all of this going before it actually did materialize. So it was an effort that was just a multi-decade effort overall. This particular map shows the Downtown Development Authority area in red. And in this particular case, that authority was used as more of a financing vehicle. And then we've got the Denver Union Station site, which is in purple overall. And there were multiple metropolitan districts, which I don't know if Dan has mentioned this, but I think that's also being contemplated for the SKB Triba redevelopment area. And so real quickly, there was a story that was part of the Denver Union Station case study, but essentially on the left is an outline of the overall development program in that area immediately around the station. There's quite a bit of retail. There's a grocery store there. There's about 2.4 million square feet of office. There's about 2,000 residential units and hotel rooms, and there's quite a bit of structured parking also in that area. There had been an economic impact study done as part of that redevelopment. And in fact, they did it a couple of different times. But essentially, they looked at the same things that we're looking at here: jobs, households, and visitors. And they came up with sort of a blended multiplier of 1.7, which we ended up using in our study just to make it somewhat easy to sort of compare the two. The next case study we looked at was Alameda Station, and as you know, that's just a few stations up the line from here. That's an ongoing transit-oriented development. It's an example of a commercial center evolving and changing in response to consumer demand. It's now in its third life overall. It started life as a Montgomery Ward anchored center, so that old mall, sort of like, you know, the old mall here at Englewood City Center. It then transitioned into a big box center, so now it's anchored by Sam's Club, and a couple of other boxes. It's now transitioning into a mixed-use, high-density, transit-oriented development. And in this particular case study, they used urban renewal. So it's something that's literally going on currently. They do have a public-private partnership with RTD for the development of the first phases, and they used their TIF to help address a regional drainage issue, which was going to actually hinder their redevelopment near the station. And so they used that to help, and what that did is that helped unlock some of the development that you're seeing there today. So if you go to Alameda and Broadway, there's just a lot going on there. There's about 1,600 apartments. I think they do have plans for some office and some other uses. They're talking about the fact that this development will happen through the 2030s. It's not going to happen right away. And they are planning for up to 10 million square feet of redevelopment, which will take some time to actually materialize. And then the final case study is Old Town Arvada. Hopefully some of you are familiar with this area. It's kind of an interesting example of much more of a suburban transit-oriented development. In their case, they have multiple urban renewal areas. They've been at it since 1980. Their benefits have taken decades to materialize. They've used their TIF and their projects to include like landmark restoration. Some of their old buildings near the stations have actually been upgraded and beautified. They've created some parks in the area. They've adaptively reused some of their buildings. They've also directly invested with some of the new redevelopments that have occurred, including apartments, hotels, as well as structured parking. And so they also did a study about the impacts of their urban renewal areas. They have about 1,100 housing units, about 1.8 million of commercial square feet. That includes both retail as well as a little bit of office. They have some hotel rooms, and they do have some new jobs overall. Their project costs, they're estimating at about $375 million. They have participated, the Urban Renewal Authority has participated to the tune of about $92 million overall, and they feel like they've leveraged about $280 million in private investment for a 3-to-1, $3.03 return overall. And so cities invest in redevelopment, and this is my concluding slide, to shape how a project benefits a community. There's a number of different reasons why cities invest, to also help maintain economic sustainability and resiliency, to broaden and diversify the economy, to avoid further economic decline, to provide enhancements for the community, to add new jobs, incomes, and tax revenues, and to also stave off further financial and physical deterioration. And so with that, I will open it up to questions.
Ms. Taniwaki, thank you very much for the presentation tonight. Gotten a lot of data tonight, so.
It's a lot of data, so.
Members of council, Member Woodward, get us started.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation.
It's
A lot of analysis.
Yeah.
I go back to, page 2, and I just look at the transit-oriented development studies and plans for cities of Aurora, Centennial, Denver, Lakewood, Longmont, Lone Tree, North Glen, Thornton, and Wheat Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
And and certainly, I mean, I'm not understanding the comparative market analysis of Inglewood and Union Station, for example. Alameda is closer. I mean, I understand that a little better, but I'm wondering why, and I'm not familiar with these, but North Glen wasn't used as a comp, and Wheat Ridge, for example, which are two like-sized cities to Inglewood. I'm just curious, that was it for the?
No, very good question. You know, I think in the case of the Wheat Ridge, and I'm thinking of their end-of-line station, literally, what we also wanted to do was find some older case studies so we could actually look at what the effects have been longer term. Because the challenge is with the North Glens and the Wheat Ridges is that they're somewhat in the same situation as you. They're ongoing. And so it's hard to measure what the long-term impacts are. So part of the combination of the fact that we chose Denver Union Station is a little bit older. Alameda's ongoing. Arvada's a little bit older as well. And so honestly, it was, I mean, we had multiple rounds of conversation about which stations to look at, and we wanted to sort of provide, so I think in total, you can take different sort of nuggets of information from each of them. There's not one that's really directly comparable to your situation. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. The North Glen situation is also very similar. I think they've done a plan relatively recently. I don't think there's been much in the way of activity that's happened.
All right, that helps me. I mean,
Okay, hopefully that
I was
helps.
just real curious when I saw Union Station being the first
Yeah, we
one
also wanted to, I mean, we were thinking about using Castle Rock and some other, they didn't have a station though, although that would have been a good comparable just because in their situation, you know, there's a downtown, they have a number of different districts, but they're also very, they have a very cohesive economic development strategy, so they're all sort of pointed in the same direction. That would have been a good comp, except for the fact that it wasn't a station, which is why we didn't include it.
Sure.
So everyone's slightly different.
Okay, thank you.
Member Anderson.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. My main question here is just how to think about this top line, because the top line number 430 million to 660 million net present value. I'm trying to figure out what all is included in that, and then just what the significance of the number is. So, am I understanding correctly that the cost of the construction itself is included in that number overall? And then so they're the 490 million total cost of construction. Is that okay?
Yeah, so what that includes is so not the 490 million, because that would make the overall number gigantic, but it's the 10.9 million in the one-time construction-related fees. So of that, so the 10.9 is basically based on that 490 million in construction fees. So that's one part of that. And then the 2.6 million in the net new annual fiscal revenues to the city, that's multiplied by 30. And so that's another component of that. And then that 30.5 million in new local expenditures from the jobs, households, and visitors, that's the other part of it that's multiplied by 30. So all of that is added together, and then it's discounted. And so at least at this point, I think that what we wanted to do was demonstrate the range of value that the project is potentially worth over 30 years to the city, just in the forms of direct revenues to the city as well as the EDDA, and then also expenditures that are made that directly benefit the economy of the city of Englewood. And so how that is used, I think that will be used in other ways further on down the line as you're considering all of the sort of the legal agreements and development agreements that you're going to be considering.
Okay, so I was kind of thinking of this in terms of kind of an ROI kind of, what kind of return are we getting on the investment? I guess our investment of somewhere between 50 and 60 million on the public investment in the project, and then there's of course the investment of the developers that are putting in over the course of 7 years hundreds of millions of dollars. It looks to me like it's if there's this net economic impact of 430 to 660 million, that's positive economic benefit to the city. But the total investment going into the project from both the city and our partners is somewhere in that same range. It looks like there's an expenditure. Am I understanding this correctly? That there's an expenditure of about 500 million and a return to the city in terms of economic impact of 500 million. Is that a valid way of looking at the number?
Yeah, part of this is getting into an arena that I think Stray with Mark Tompkins is, as well as some other folks will be getting into in terms of what that sort of return on investment would be. We sort of deliberately didn't get into specifically what that public request was going to be, mostly because I think it's still being considered at this point. But what you would compare that 430 to 662 would be whatever the public investment would be, and that whatever that request is, and then that private investment, essentially how you would look at it is you're saying that you take your 50, 60 million,
Okay.
and you are leveraging whatever that developer is putting in. So really what you're doing is you're focusing on comparing that 430 to 660 to whatever they're asking of you, the city.
So if we
that's one
invest
calculation.
60 million up front, or, I think it would be appropriate to calculate the net present value of whatever, if you're comparing net present value of the total investment in terms of debt and everything for the DDA and the TIF to that 430 to 660 million in terms of the net present value there. So those are kind of the two numbers that when, analyzing this, I really want to, I want to see both of those numbers side by side. And we got the one 430 to 660. So what's that other one? And then I think the other relevant one is kind of what's our what kind of value are we getting in terms of tax, tax revenue? And I saw in here that we're expecting, 50 to 60 million of tax revenue over the 30 years as well. In the report, I think it was on page 6. But we're investing, potentially 50 to 60 million up front. So it doesn't seem like that's maybe quite a helpful analysis. We need to really compare it, since we're going to be making back in taxes the same amount we're investing over 30 years. It's kind of a wash there. So we really want to compare it to the total, that total net present value in terms of the local economic impact.
So perhaps it would be easier so I've just shown you that 2.6 million in the net new annual fiscal revenues to the city, and maybe it would be helpful to take that, multiply it out by 30, to show that actual calculation, and then to compare that to whatever that public investment request is. That might be a simpler way. Is that a simpler way of showing
Yeah,
that?
that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just that right now, I'm not sure, and Dan will have to clarify if that actual number is available, that number that they're requesting.
Right.
So that's the only thing.
Thank you.
And actually, just to piggyback on that, so when I was thinking about the tax revenues as well, but wouldn't you include the tier 1 and the tier 2 as well? Because I think from this slide, it's just the core. So
Right.
I was thinking of it that way, but I'm not sure if that's something that we would include. But
I think that's a really good way of looking at it, because the city center core redevelopment should really catalyze fairly quickly the redevelopment in the tier 1 area. And the other thing I'll just mention in passing is that we made a decision not to look at kind of the typical economic engine driver analysis, which you look at the impact across the entire city. So we said we're not going to make any attempt at quantifying that in this study, but by all, standard measures, it should be, rather large in addition to the core tier 1, tier 2 impacts. So that hasn't been included here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Poremba. Member Russell, you're up next.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So the figures in your calculations are predicated on the information that you've been given by SKB. So, and whoever else, but if they choose down the road not to build the hotel or do whatever, if they change anything, then these numbers would no longer be accurate. Is that correct?
I think the general idea that we're heading towards is that the master development agreement between the city and SKB Triba will in fact define what the project is in terms of square footages, uses, periods of time. So I think the numbers, while they might occur in slightly different time periods, that's what we envision for the project. And so it's very likely that they'll take place. And I think it's important to remember their role is that of master developer. So their number one priority is to try to find vertical developers for each of those projects that are part of the project, even though they may end up ultimately self-performing the development of one or two elements. So to answer your question, I would say it's highly probable that those developments will take place, and there'll be in the master development agreement measures for the city to step in and actually take corrective action in the event that any of those things are not being produced as agreed to.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess the one thing that we as a council need to look at, and it goes back to, I believe what Councilmember Anderson was talking about, is return on investment. Because when you were talking about the Alameda Station, for instance, that whole redevelopment thing has been going on since the 1980s. And so what I've seen in some other redevelopments is by the time you get it paid for, you have to go into debt again to redo whatever. And so, anyway.
Well, I think that's one of the messages overall is like, it's not one and done. It's, with a lot of these, particularly like the Alameda stations, you do have to make a constant sort of concerted effort to make sure that, you stay relevant with what people want. People don't go to Montgomery wards anymore. People shop very, very differently. And so, I think part of it is just understanding that this is, somewhat of a business investment, as well, that you're wanting to make sure that you stay relevant and that you're also able to then offer services to the community that they're looking for.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll go to Mayor Pro Tem since he hasn't asked the question just yet. Go ahead, Mayor Pro Tem.
A couple of the projects that you noted used URA as an element, and we're not using a URA here. Can you talk a little bit about what is different based on a DDA as opposed to URA?
That's a really good question. I think in the cases that we picked, we were really sort of focusing on tax increment financing and the districts that were used, and so it was a combination of DDAs as well as URAs. There are some differences in terms of how they're set up, in terms of, they're not exactly the same. They're sometimes used somewhat similarly. There is some flexibility in terms of how you use DDAs overall. I think that that's something that the EDDA is looking into in terms of financing. What's our appropriate role? Mr. Bernberg with Northland is here, and he's helping the EDDA out with that. But our examples here were really intended to show the fact that there's actually a variety of different tools that you can use, and there is some flexibility. You just need to define exactly what you're comfortable with in terms of how you would like to use those tools.
Thank you. I'd also like to echo while I have the floor some of the concerns that my fellow council members have noted on the potential investment that we're looking at here. And I know the economic impact would largely be positive, but we're being potentially asked to put forward a large chunk of change at the outset, or property that has significant value at the outset of this. So going forward, it's important to me to really see how the investment of taxpayer dollars is justified as a stimulating the private sector in this area, and how that benefits ultimately the taxpayers of Inglewood. I get some of that from this, but it still strikes me as a bit of a gamble, and that's concerning to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are always a bit of a gamble. I mean, it's a pretty significant, you're right, it's a pretty significant chunk of public money. Other cities have done it. That doesn't make it any easier for you. I think Dan's mentioned development agreement. I mean, there's certain agreements that you need to put into place in order to make sure that you're protected as a city as well. And you want to make sure that that developer performs and that they provide what it is you're looking for. So some of it is coming down to defining exactly what you want from the development as well.
That's helpful. I'll also note, I think one of the things that really does kind of capture my attention on this is it feels a lot like we're being asked to do what we were asked to do 20 years ago. And like we already tried this once, and now we're going back to the drawing board and trying it again. And that makes me a little nervous as well. So those are some of my concerns going forward, but I appreciate the information that you've shared, and I'm looking forward to more information in the future.
Member Woodward.
Thank you. On slide 6, you show the first and second tiers, and what I believe is that area south of US 285, that second tier area that appears to go all the way, I think, to Cherokee or something like that. Do you see that as organic, that once this started happening and possibly the main city center part happening, then this would organically, the developers or owners would want to develop that? Or do you see the city coming in and?
That's a really good question, because you do have a barrier of 285 to some extent, and you know these tend to be contiguous. Would there be a need for, now in the context of the next step study and some of the previous plans that I've been involved in, we did have property owners come to the meeting indicating interest in redevelopment. And then also at the Sports Authority site, there is something going on. So it does indicate that there is some interest in sort of going past this barrier of Hamden. As to whether or not there would be the need for a little bit of incentive, you know, it's sort of hard to say, but I think that there's probably general interest in what's happening north of Hamden, and certainly if they felt that there was, you know, an economic opportunity, that some would you know, leap on that opportunity.
Okay. But you weren't thinking condemnation or anything?
Oh, no.
No.
We're not even, no, we're not going there.
Please. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Member Anderson.
Thank you again. I'm still trying to get my mind around the meaning and significance of the number here. On page 45 in your report, you have a breakdown of a comparison of employment earnings, fiscal impacts, comparing the old city center to the new redevelopment. I kind of went through and added up the numbers, and it looks like there's about $100 million represented on this in terms of the net new investment. Is this over the 30 years, and how does this relate to the is this a part of the 430 to 660 million number, or how does this relate to that?
it is, so you see the 2.6 on that particular table, the 2,605,729 number.
Yeah.
So that is the 2.6 million that's referenced in the table that's shown on the screen. So that's the overlap there. This particular table is like a one-time glance at what's under old is what's there currently. New is all that redevelopment in the area. So however long that takes. And then the net new is just one subtracted from the other.
So I thought the 2.6 in the overall number was the net new tax revenue, but that's under the old column in here. What am I missing?
Oh, wait a minute. Okay, it's the wrong 2.6. 2.2633861.
Oh.
It's
Got
it's
it. Okay,
above.
that
Sorry.
2.6.
Yeah.
Right, got it. Okay.
Does that make sense? Sorry, I was looking at the wrong.
So this is
set.
this is an annual
Right.
then this overall this is an
Right.
annual thing. So that 2.6 is the 2.6.
Right.
Is the fiscal benefits? Oh, that's city, county, and state. So
Yeah. So the
you-
bottom number
the
is city,
sales
county,
tax
state, right.
and the sales tax and property tax, some of that would be included in your overall number for the city's benefit, but not all those numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Helpful.
Ms. Taniwaki, I think I have one question, and it's really just clarification just because of the definition that we heard in the previous presentation. But when we talk about affordable housing units, are we using the definitions that we saw earlier, the 30, 50, 80% AMI? I know during one of the case studies, I believe it was the Alameda, they do have the breakdown of what units are affordable, but I just want to compare apples to apples to the previous conversation.
Good question. I think we'll have to clarify that with SKB in terms of their dedicated building, affordable workforce housing, which I think is 127 units. So we'll get into that, and that again can be one of the items addressed in the master development agreement with them.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you for that. Any other questions from council? Don't think I see any. Mr. Poremba, Ms. Taniwaki, thank you very much for the presentation, all the data. Yeah, we look forward to continuing these conversations in the months ahead. So thank you very much for the research on this.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, council, I think we are moving on to boards and commission reports. Does anybody have anything for tonight? Member Woodward.
Parks and Recreation meeting last week. Let's see, just a few updates. Supply chain stuff on playground equipment for parks is coming, is starting to move in. So we will be seeing restrooms at Cushing, Baker, Jason, and Centennial, I think by this time snow falls for sure. Also, just as an update too, the parking lot for Bellevue is looking at being open by the end of this month. And parks or somebody's working with Excel about additional lighting or new lighting. Also possibility of path lighting, path solar lighting to see what that would be through the park, just as a safety type thing. So number of things going on there. If everybody or anybody's been by Cushing Park recently, you'll see that the old skate park is gone. The new skate park is pretty well moving along. It's nearing completion. So there'll probably be a celebration, hopefully by the end of September over there for reopening that park. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Woodward. Anyone else? Member Wink.
Thanks, Mayor. This won't be an exciting update, but on the 31st, the Historic Preservation Commission held their meeting, and we didn't have quorum, nor did the scheduled speaker arrive at the meeting. So the meeting ended after just a few minutes, and we'll try to recover what should have been discussed in this meeting later on.
Thank you, Member Wink. Mayor Pro Tem.
I have a question for Member Woodward. You mentioned the parking lot. Is that the Chenango lot at Bellevue Park?
Correct.
And that's expected to reopen at the end of the month?
Yes.
And do you know the plan? Are they opening and closing it with volunteers, or is it to remain permanently open?
They're looking at or talking to volunteers, seeing about volunteers, and having a little more police activity at night
Okay.
in there.
I asked because there was a thread on Nextdoor earlier this week in regards to that lot. So I'd like to inform the posters on that thread of our plan going forward. That's helpful. Thank you.
You bet.
Anyone else? Not, I do have one. ETAC did meet this past Thursday night. One was we did have a member from, it wasn't Dr. Cog, but they came from RTD, I believe. But basically there was another project that for federal improvements, I'm trying to think of the corridor, but basically there is a portion that they're asking Inglewood to participate in. The members of ETAC did not vote to recommend that City Council take this on. Part of the reason for it is that we're so far along in our budget cycle that they didn't feel that it was prudent for us or for them to make that suggestion at this time. The rep from RTD or that organization did state that we could budget it out over a 2-year period if we like. Made mention to it to our city manager, that conversation, but that was one of the first topics that they discussed that night. The other one was just the ongoing discussions about the old Hampton Complete Streets project. So there was a little bit more, there was a further update on that and just additional conversation from ETAC, but that was the extent of it. I have nothing else. Moving on to council members' choice. Anyone tonight? Don't see anything. City managers update.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to report I had a good meeting today with the city managers of Littleton and Sheridan. We do have our joint cities meeting with those two cities coming up. Tri-Cities for several years has been meeting to talk about areas of shared interest. That's mostly been the Tri-Cities Homelessness Policy Committee, but we are working to put together some agenda topics for that, including a Tri-Cities action plan update, potentially just updates from each city about some major projects that are going on, as well as our representative on the regional opioid settlement group reporting out to the 3 councils about what's going on. Would just like to invite you, if you have additional topics for that meeting, to let me know. And on the lines of the Tri-Cities Homelessness Policy Group, we do have a grand opening this week for Cross Purpose. That'll be Thursday, September 15th at 1 p.m. This is an anti-poverty initiative that council supported with our American Rescue Plan Act dollars. And so that grand opening will be at 3855 South Broadway, and I plan to attend. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions from council? What was the date on that?
That's this Thursday.
Was it 1 o'clock?
Yes, at 1 o'clock. I was asked to speak at that. I suggested that they might ask a council member instead, so I don't know if any of you have been asked. Oh, you have been? Okay, great. I think that would be preferable if that's okay.
The hand was raised, so I don't see. Oh, Member Russell.
Thank you. I just have a question. So, I mean, because council as a whole together has not been notified, are we coming forward with dissolution for EAF?
Yes, I believe that's still in process. Actually, today I contacted Terracon regarding the status of the environmental review, because that was one of the issues we were waiting on. I also contacted the members of the EAF board regarding legal representation that could specifically guide the EAF board during this process. And we've also been studying different property management options for the EAF board, both currently now that former chairman has left the city, so is no longer serving, and then after dissolution, what those options are. And Sean worked with community development to evaluate those already. So yes, we are moving forward, and it still is in process.
So it'll take a while yet.
Well, from my perspective, I have an obligation to ensure the city does not become the owner of property that presents an environmental hazard, and that's actually in municipal code. So from my perspective, I still need to see that environmental assessment before I can recommend the city accept any property from EVE.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mayor, can I add to that?
Yes, go ahead, City Manager.
Thank you. And Member Russell, another thing that we are working on as an interim step to just keep the board going with one out of our 3 board members gone is next week. We have an item on your agenda that will be the appointment of the interim public works director to that board, just to replace that. Code does specifically, we changed this since I've been here for the council to actually vote on that. So it's not a resolution or an ordinance or anything, it's just a voice vote. But we will put that on your agenda for next week.
Thank you very much.
Anything else, City Manager?
No, thank you.
Anything else from council? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Have a good night, everyone.